Okay, so we're back, and so the meditation form is changing, but I like to think of this period also as a continuation of our meditation. We, in the beginning, practiced mostly this kind of internal mindfulness, and now we are practicing what the Buddha called internal mindful and external mindfulness.
Can you
So
speak up a little, please?
I'll try. Maybe we can close the doors, that might help. So this internal and external mindfulness means that we are listening not only to the words, the sentiments behind them, the field of energy in the room that we've created, but also the response in our heart to all these things. So I'm just back from another period of retreat practice. I was on retreat, personal retreat for 14 days, and then I was back for a week, and then 9 days, and I've been back for a week. And I always say this when I'm here, but I find retreat practice to be incredibly helpful. You know, it's you go to a place where life is just less complex, and in the absence of that complexity, there's just more space to really touch deeply into what we usually don't have time to touch into. And I really do feel now, having done quite a lot of retreat practice, that it is a kind of aid. It hastens our spiritual development. So just an encouragement. The other thing that happens when you come back from retreat, and I've been going and coming a lot, is that you begin to notice the contrast. You know, what it's like to practice in this artificial environment where it's very supportive, and what it's like to practice in the quote-unquote real world where we don't have that kind of support. And this contrast is really illuminating, because it shows us where our efforts are needed. You know, what is our edge? What are the difficulties that we get into in our regular life? So today I wanted to talk mostly about anxiety, because this is what I'm noticing in the contrast between more peaceful realms that happen on retreat and living in this world. And I'm using this term kind of broadly to refer to a broad range of experiences, from kind of mild restlessness to worry, agitation, something short of panic or primal fear, so in that realm. It's kind of I experience this as a feeling of nervous unease, which has a particular vibrational quality that many of you probably know, and it has this signature that there's a lot of energy, but it's trying to do something, but it doesn't quite know what to do, so there's no sense of progress or movement. And almost everyone I know has some version of this experience. You know, out of the blue, two of my friends from high school Facebooked me, two separate people who I haven't spoken to in decades. And they said some version of, I see that you're a meditation teacher. Can meditation help me with my anxiety? This is just so prevalent. It's almost the norm when I look at the forms of people taking a meditation class. Anxiety, insomnia, which is closely related, and depression are across the board pretty much. But much of what I'm going to say actually applies to any kind of afflictive state of mind. So if you're one of those rare people who's immune to the anxieties of the day, you can just fill in the blank with whatever you're dealing with. This is from The Onion. Paterson, New Jersey. Quickly kicking off his sheets and reaching for a notepad on his nightstand, local 27-year-old Kyle Dowling reportedly sprang out of bed at 3 a.m. to jot down an idea for a brand new worry. Quote, sometimes the best, most crippling new anxieties just come to you in the middle of the night. So it's good to always have pen and paper nearby to record it, said Dowling, rapidly scribbling several shorthand notes about a new feeling of debilitating self-doubt and apprehension that had just spontaneously entered his mind. Quote, if I think of a new paralyzing fear and I don't immediately write it down, there's a good chance I'll totally forget it. Upon waking up and rereading his notes from the previous night, Dowling confirmed to reporters that the new worry was even greater than he first thought. When I was on a long retreat in February, it was right after the inauguration, and I just went away for 58 days, completely cloistered from all news of the outside world. And I began to feel what I was calling this sort of like sense of dread, really intense feeling of anxious worry. And I went into a practice interview with my teacher, and he said, as they say, how's your practice going? And I said, I just feel this intense sense of dread. It's horrible. And he said something to the effect of, I'm really sorry that you're suffering from this, but I'm actually quite happy that you're feeling dread. He kind of raised his eyebrow. And I wish I could remember exactly what he said, but it was something to the effect of that this feeling of dread is a natural response of a caring heart. It's a sign that I hadn't closed down or lost my connection to the larger world, and that the problem actually wasn't the dread itself, but the way that I was relating to it and that I was seeing it as a problem. There's a similar sentiment in the quote from environmentalist Julia Butterfly Hill, where she says, if you're not angry, then you're asleep. And in that frame shift, when I began to actually attend to this feeling of dread, rather than just trying to push it away, or all the machinations that you go through to try to avoid that discomfort, when I actually just surrendered to it, it actually opened to a broader range of experience. There's anger and sorrow and regret, almost a kind of mourning process happened for me. And, this is unpleasant, but it has movement. Dread feels kind of stuck, but sorrow or sort of grieving process is something that you can move through or can move through you in a way that's actually quite healing. And this is kind of an aside, but I think it's worth noting, I see a lot in myself and other people that whenever there's some difficulty, especially if it's an emotional difficulty, there's kind of a tendency to, like a sense that it's our fault, that there's some mistake, that we've done something wrong. If we're meditators, we might think, we're not practicing correctly. And I was talking to Gabrielle about this yesterday. There's a kind of a new agey culture that almost assigns blame, like when things aren't going well, which is actually a horrible misunderstanding of karma. The teaching of karma is always forward-looking, that we can reap fortunate circumstances through our actions of the moment. And in fact, the Buddha said to look backwards to try to figure out how you got here would actually drive you insane, that it's just too complicated. And from this kind of like misunderstanding, there can be self-judgment and self-aggression. And so when I was working through the dread initially, this was sort of what was coming up. It was sort of like self-aggressive, unhelpful patterns of conditioning. And this relates to the seminal teachings of the Dharma, which are that in this human incarnation, there is some measure of suffering. And fact, the whole path is based on this understanding that this is where we are, and that the path is a way to decrease our suffering. But when I think about anxiety, like, how can we not be anxious? Like when the planet and the ecosystems are in grave distress, driven by a kind of human greed and loss for reverence. How can we not be anxious in a culture that prioritizes busyness over human connection and appearance over authenticity? How can we not be anxious when the sense of division and conflict in the public discourse is being sort of deliberately heightened to keep us on edge? And this time certainly has its unique challenges, there's no question about that. But here's what the Buddha said 2,000 years ago, over 2,000 years ago. Fear comes from resorting to violence. Look at people quarreling. I shall describe my agitation and how it was experienced by me. This is kind of unusual, this is the Buddha after his awakening talking about what it's like to be agitated. Look at people quarreling. I shall describe my agitation and how it was experienced by me. Seeing people struggling like fish, writhing in shallow water with enmity against one another, I became afraid. At one time, I wanted to find some place where I could take shelter, but I never saw any such place. There is nothing in this world that is solid at base, and not a part of it that is changeless. I have seen all trapped in mutual conflict, and this is why I felt so repelled. And then I noticed something deep in their hearts. I could barely make it out. A dart in the heart. Victims run all over the place, but once it has been pulled out, all that running is finished, and so is the exhaustion that comes with it. So this anxiety that we experience is trying to tell us something. But it's almost like we want to kill the messenger. But the messenger's job is not to leave until the message has been delivered. One simple example that comes up for me is I tend to procrastinate. And inevitably, with procrastination, as the deadline approaches, there is this sense of anxiety that arises. And I've started to think of that as like, a good friend who's kind of like tugging at my sleeve saying, get your act together. And just that sort of acknowledgement actually can shift the energy from avoidance to engagement, that energy of anxiety can actually give me fuel to get the unpleasant task completed. Other times when I'm sensing into like this sense of anxiety, I can see the dart. In Buddhist psychology, the shorthand we use for these darts are greed, endless wanting of things, the kind of desires that can never really be fulfilled, aversion, all the things that we don't like or we're resisting against, and confusion, the way in which we don't really see the world as it is, that we see things as fixed when they're actually always in flux, and we see things as so personal when in many ways they are universal. Many of us take on this task of trying to arrange our life so perfectly that we only have these sort of pleasant, good experiences. And this endeavor itself generates anxiety because it's almost impossible to do. But I like this image that our suffering is catalyzed by these kind of foreign bodies that get embedded in the heart. And that practice is actually a kind of inner surgery where we fish these darts out. quote from a Zen master. The field of boundless emptiness is what exists from the very beginning. You must purify, cure, grind down, or brush away all the tendencies you've fabricated. Then you can reside in the clear circle of brightness. Your deep source, transparent to the bottom, can radiantly shine and respond unencumbered to every speck of dust. You know, in some ways, I think this anxiety is kind of our evolutionary inheritance. I have this image of, you know, monkeys eons ago who are like, you know, really loving and open and calm creatures, and, you know, one of them is in the jungles and sees a lion and it thinks, oh, kitty, let's go pet the lion. Those monkeys are not our ancestors. The ones that are our ancestors were the ones that were nervously flitting about, alert to every danger and protecting themselves. This system of anxiety, that feedback system that gives us anxiety, is actually there to serve us. You know. So how do we practice with this? You know, I really like when I'm feeling especially intense. I was actually doing this before the talk, walking meditation. Just picking a spot, 10 paces, connecting with the energy of the earth, the receptivity of the feet to feel all the sensations of what it means to walk. For me, it's supportive to walk slowly and gently, kind of coming out of all the spinning of the mind and dropping into the low center of gravity, back and forth. It's very calming. Or maybe we have a resource like yoga or qigong or tai chi or some other kind of contemplative movement that can kind of opens a door where our meditation can become more grounded because it connects us to our bodies. And this embodiment is kind of fundamental to the Dharma also, because the Buddha taught that mindfulness of the body is, my favorite quote, the direct path for purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of suffering and discontent. It's a pretty good endorsement. So often we begin the sitting practice by, as we did today, attending to the breath, the ebb and flow of this energy in the body, and trying as best we can to leave everything else kind of in the background. I like this image of being at a party. Maybe it's like a lively but not overly loud party, and you're perfectly able to have a conversation with someone where you're engaged with what they're saying, you're having a connection and a communication, and all this activity is just resting in the background. Not necessarily trying to make it go away or engage with it, it's just there. And it's not a problem. And when we can connect more directly with the sensations of the body, the stillness of the body, the kind of non-doing quality of meditation, a restful quality, it kind of allows space for the mind and body to come back to some kind of equilibrium. You know, it's like if you walk up a flight of steps rapidly, you're out of breath, but then if you stop and have some space, the breath returns to normal. I also like the image of a snow globe. You know, there's no amount of manipulation or like drink this way or that way that can settle the contents of the snow globe. The only thing that settles it is stillness. And in that stillness, it settles by its own nature. So we actually don't have to do anything. This is from the Dhammapada, also the words of the Buddha. The restless, agitated mind, hard to protect, hard to control, the sage makes straight as the Fletcher the shaft of an arrow. For one who's awake, whose mind isn't overflowing, whose heart isn't afflicted, one who has abandoned both merit and demerit, fear does not exist. So when we sit in our meditation practice and anxiety appears, this is something we're actually being asked to investigate. What is it like to be a human being experiencing anxiety? How do we connect with the experience? And this word vipassana, the type of meditation we do, it means to cut through, to see more deeply, to connect with on another level. And so one of the ways we do this kind of investigation is by breaking apart the experience. Like, what are the sensations in the body? Maybe there's some tension, maybe there's a restless moving energy in some area, maybe there's some sense of stuckness, like a pit in the stomach, the throat. And so we bring this kind of mindful awareness that's not trying to fix it or make it go away or making judgments about it, but just to attend, just to feel, just to know. And for the moment, the narratives of the thinking of mind rest in the background. That party will keep going, but we just keep our attention here. And then connecting with the elements of the sensations of the body that we might characterize as emotions, fear, sorrow, regret, whatever's present, connecting with that, the same attitude, not trying to fix it, not trying to make it go away, just to know it. And in my experience, to allow the heart to feel what the heart wants to feel is actually one of the most profound things that we can do. I sometimes wonder what the planet would be like if this were our culture. Like, we acknowledge certain normal human bodily functions. Like, what if next to every restroom we had a crying room and a yelling, screaming, rubber padded room? It's often helpful to label these experiences. You drop just a word into the mind stream. Tingling, vibration, pulsation, gyration, tension, stuckness, sadness, sorrow, whatever it is. There's actually research that shows that this labeling reduces the intensity of an intense experience, and many of us know from our own experience that that's true. This labeling also builds what the Buddha called sampajanya, which is usually translated as clear comprehension. So we're developing a more intimate relationship with what's actually happening in our mind-body in a way that we can actually begin to see the patterns. And when we can see the patterns, we have access to letting go of the patterns that don't serve us. And when we turn to our thoughts, when anxiety is present, usually there's what the Buddha called papancha, proliferation of thoughts, the kind of recurring, rehashing thoughts. The Buddha said that it's like an ox becoming enamored by its tail. And my sense is that maybe there's some part of the mind that thinks that it's problem solving, Like, it seems like the thing to do, but there's no creativity, there's no reflection, there's no insight. It's just sort of like, usually for me, rehashing the same worn out themes again and again, which actually amplifies the sense of being anxious. And when there's an afflictive emotion that's driving a narrative, I think that I find it's very hard to negotiate with this narrative, because these narratives have their own alternative facts, and you can't argue with them. And this is why finding a refuge in the body is so helpful. It's a quote from Kabir that I've been reading a lately. Be strong then and enter your own body. There you have a solid place for your feet. Think about it carefully. Don't go off anywhere else. Just throw away all thoughts of imaginary things and stand firm in that which you are. And just to say that sometimes we get the idea in meditation that, we should get rid of our thoughts or that we shouldn't be thinking. And it is true, I've had this experience in practice where the mind can get very, very quiet. There's not a lot of thinking, and it's beautiful. It's very peaceful, but not really sustainable in normal life. And so our task is not to get rid of our thoughts, but really to look at how we relate to them. And for me, the way of working with a lot of thoughts has been to ignore the vast majority of them. Like thoughts appear in the mind like saliva in the mouth, coming out of nowhere. A flash of fireworks in a blackened sky appear and then disappear. And we give them a lot of importance. And the thing is, it's all constantly changing. Like we know this on an intellectual level, but if we can really live from this place of understanding that it's all changing constantly, all the time, even our whole lifetime is a blink of an eye in celestial time, we could chill out a little bit. The Buddha said that to truly know change, even for the snap of a finger, is like a powerful spiritual realization. So it's easy to say, touch into your experience, feel the feelings you're feeling, but sometimes this is difficult. Sometimes these things are painful. One dimension that I've begun to explore more deeply, which was the kind of theme of the retreat from last week, is this devotional practice. So the retreat I went to was a synthesis of the sort of Theravada Buddhism that we talk about here, and the Mahayana Zen tradition, which there's a lot of chanting, a lot of prostrations, a lot of invocations of Kuan Yin, who's a kind of embodiment of compassion. They say that Kuan Yin is the one that listens to the cries of the world with ease. And I actually have, like some personal trauma around devotional practice, because that's my history with my parents' religion, and never really liked the idea of bowing and sort of like baggage that I have around it. But in doing these practices, I began to see that this is really a way, like we use these symbols and we contort the body, and there's a sense of surrendering, but it's actually surrendering to that part of ourselves that can listen to the cries of the world with ease, that can listen to our own cries with ease. One of the things that Thanissara said, which one of the teachers at the retreat, she said that their focus is on the embodiment of insight that reveals a blessed sacredness within all life. Through training, attention, wise discernment, and investigation, the undying Dharma is intuitively known as the core matrix of pure consciousness within all that emerges and all that dissolves. And such knowing begins to transform our world, personally and collectively, enabling and strengthening an inner sense of freedom and confidence. When the inner experience is difficult, one of the things that can support us is another version of directed thought. One directed thought that's really interesting to play with is, who's anxious? Who's anxious? This is a kind of a koan, that can break the idea that we can figure it out. A fallacy that we can think our way into being wiser. Or or we can call upon the great ancient mantra used by parents from time immemorial. It's okay. Or maybe it's gonna be okay. You know, when a mother or a father says this to a child who's been hurt in some way, it's just like the sweetest, most sincere, heartfelt support. And this is a kind of support that we can give to ourselves. And even if it's not okay, that's okay. This is kind of a version of Om Mani Padme Hum. Not as catchy. Some lines from the poem aloud. When loss rips off the doors of your heart, or sadness fails your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. Another dart that I experience is wanting a sense of certainty and security. But as Ajahn Chah famously said, clicking to a sense of security is a recipe for suffering. The only thing certain is that things must inevitably be uncertain, and they cannot be otherwise. And actually the sense of security and certainty that we mostly have is illusory. You know, things can change in a minute. Anything can happen at any time. So the proposition is that we trade this desire for security with a sense of confidence. This is the ultimate antidote to anxiety. So rather than trying to hold it all together in this sort of perfect alignment, we develop a confidence from our practice that however it goes, this heart can meet that experience. This is a profound freedom. And the beauty of it is that we only have to attend to this moment. That's it, just this moment. This is from Mingyur Rinpoche. Though we're conditioned to identify with the thoughts that pass through our awareness rather than the awareness itself, the awareness that is our true nature is infinitely flexible. It is capable of any and every sort of experience, even misconceptions about itself as trapped, limited, anxious, lonely, or afraid. And when we begin to identify with that timeless, pristine awareness rather than with the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that pass through it, we've taken the first step towards freedom. And one of the irony about anxiety as it relates to, worries about the future is that we're actually really bad at predicting about how we will feel in the future. There's this whole body of research called affect prediction. And it basically shows that we overestimate the amount of happiness we'll get from a good thing. They studied lottery winners who have like a spike of happiness, and within a year and a half they return to pre-lottery levels of happiness. And actually with a high percentage of the lottery winners got less happy because of all the problems of everybody wanting money from them. And there was another study where they looked at spinal cord victims, like people who had versions of paralysis, and it was the same thing. Slight period of unhappiness and returning to normal. And there's a whole theory that's evolving around this. There's kind of a set point for happiness. And one of the studies, I don't know how they come up with this number, but they were attributing 10% of your happiness quotient to external circumstances. Like 50% is genetic and 40% is kind of within our control. This is consistent with the Dharma. The Dharma tells us that happiness cannot be dependent on external conditions. If we're dependent on external conditions that are constantly changing, then how can we find a stable, lasting happiness? In the Mangala Sutta, the Buddha describes the awakened mind as unshaken, beyond all sorrow, spotless, pure. So I'll leave you with a poem. This is called The Dakini Speaks. And I looked up this word dakini. Here's the Wikipedia definition of dakini. A female of generally volatile temperament who acts as a muse for spiritual practice. The dakini speaks. My friends, let's grow up. Let's stop pretending we don't know the deal here. Or if we haven't noticed, let's wake up and notice. Look, everything that can be lost will be lost. It's simple. How could we have missed it for so long? Let's grieve our losses fully like ripe human beings, but please, let's not be so shocked by them. Let's not act so betrayed, as though life has broken her secret promise to us. Impermanence is life's only promise to us, and she keeps it with ruthless impeccability. To a child, she seems cruel, but she's only wild, and her compassion is exquisitely precise, brilliantly penetrating, luminous, and truth. She strips away the unreal to show us the real. This is the true ride. Let's give ourselves to it. Let's stop making deals for safe passage. There isn't one anyway, and the cost is too high. We are not children anymore. The true human adult gives everything for what cannot be lost. Let's dance the wild dance of no hope. Did I write that down? I didn't write that down. It's called The Dakini Speaks. So thank you for your kind listening. Before we leave Facebook, I had a bunch of announcements, but I'm going to save them for the end. So thank you. Oh, yeah, InsightLA counts on philanthropy to keep its doors open. There's a donate button, and any generosity you're able to offer is greatly